By April of 1865, in the smoky streets of Richmond, Virginia, a barrel of flour cost $1,000. A single cup of coffee, if you could find one, would set you back $70, and a pair of boots to replace the ones rotting off a soldier's feet cost more than a private I.S. accumulated wages for the entire war. In the gutters of the burning Capitol, Confederate soldiers were seen tossing handfuls of paper money into the fires, realizing the blue and gray notes generated more value as kindling than they did as currency. This wasn't just the result of a military defeat. It was the mathematical inevitability of an economic suicide pact. 4 years earlier, the Confederate States of America had been, on paper, one of the wealthiest distinct economic zones on the planet. They controlled the single most vital commodity of the industrial age. They had the geopolitical leverage to bring the superpowers of Europe to their knees, and yet they ended the war destitute, their financial system vaporized, and their society hollowed out from the inside by an inflation rate of 4,000%. We often look at the American Civil War through the lens of generals, battlefields, and moral crusades. But if you want to understand why the South really collapsed, you have to look at the ledger. You have to understand how a government bet its entire existence on a single asset, played a game of geopolitical poker with the British Empire, and bluffed its way into total ruin. This is the story of how King Cotton became the architect of its own destruction. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, we have to step back to the golden age of 1860. It is almost impossible to overstate the economic dominance of the American South at this moment. In the mid-19th century, cotton was what oil became in the 20th century. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. The textile mills of Manchester, England, and Lille, France, employed millions of workers and generated massive portions of their respective nations' GDP. And the American South supplied nearly 80% of that cotton. The Southern planter class knew this. They weren't just farmers, they were the oil barons of their day. They believed they held a leash around the neck of the global economy. Senator James Henry Hammond famously declared on the Senate floor, "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." This wasn't just a slogan, it was the foundational dogma of their foreign policy. The logic was simple. If war broke out, the South wouldn't even need to fight. They would simply snap their fingers, cut off the supply of fiber, and the economies of Britain and France would grind to a halt. To prevent mass unemployment and riots in their own streets, those European powers would be forced to intervene, break any northern blockade, and recognize the Confederacy. It was a seductive theory. It made the Southern elite feel invincible, but it relied on a static view of the world, a belief that markets never adjust, that buyers never look for alternatives, and that a monopoly once held is held forever. This hubris masked a terrifying structural weakness. The South was asset-rich, but cash-poor. Their wealth was illiquid, trapped in land, and, horrifically, in the bodies of nearly 4 million enslaved people. They had almost no gold, no silver, and no native financial infrastructure. They had no way to pay for a modern war unless they could sell their cotton. And this brings us to the mechanism of failure. When a government goes to war, it has 3 ways to pay for it: taxation, borrowing, or printing money. Taxation requires a mature bureaucracy and a willing populace. The Confederacy had neither. Their entire political ideology was built on states' rights and a deep suspicion of centralized power. The idea of Richmond sending tax collectors to seize property in Georgia was politically impossible. They managed to enact a small direct tax, but it was negligible. Borrowing was equally difficult. Without recognized sovereignty, European banks were hesitant to lend the South gold. Why buy the bonds of a nation that might not exist in a year? That left the third option, printing money. But to print money that holds value, you need trust or you need backing. The South had cotton to back their currency, but only if that cotton could reach the market and be exchanged for hard currency, gold or British pounds. This is where the tragedy transforms into farce. This is where we find the fatal mistake. In the spring and summer of 1861, before the Union Navy had effectively blockaded the southern coast, the Confederate government made a decision that historians still analyze with disbelief. They did not rush to ship every bale of cotton to Europe to build up a war chest of gold. They didn't fill British warehouses to create a line of credit. Instead, they did the opposite. The Confederate government and local committees of public safety imposed a voluntary embargo. They banned the export of their own cash crop. They believed they needed to starve Europe of cotton immediately to force diplomatic recognition. They refused to sell. They let the ships sit empty. In a display of fanatical commitment to their economic theory, planters burned 2.5 million bales of cotton right there in the fields and on the wharves. They incinerated their own capital. They destroyed the only thing that could have backed their currency. It was an attempt at geopolitical blackmail, and it backfired spectacularly. The Confederate leadership had missed a crucial piece of data. The British had seen this coming. In the years prior to the war, British merchants had stockpiled massive reserves of cotton. When the South turned off the tap, the British textile mills didn't stop. They just worked through their inventory. The immediate crisis the South was counting on never materialized. By the time the British stockpiles began to run low in late 1862, the moment had passed. The Union Navy had tightened its blockade, making it difficult to ship cotton out even if the South wanted to. But worse, the market had pivoted. High prices are the best cure for high prices. Seeing the disruption in America, British buyers turned their eyes to India and Egypt. They invested in infrastructure in the Nile Delta and the Deccan Plateau. They transformed global supply chains. By withholding their product, the South didn't blackmail Europe. They incentivized Europe to create the South's competition. They lost their monopoly forever. Trapped with no tax revenue and no export income, the Confederate Treasury Secretary Christopher Meminger was left with a single blunt instrument, the printing press. The government began issuing paper notes, the famous graybacks. At first, they traded near par with gold, but as the printing presses ran 24 hours a day to pay for soldiers, gunpowder, and uniforms, the laws of economics took hold. When you double the amount of money in an economy without doubling the amount of goods, you cut the value of that money in half. The Confederacy didn't just double the money supply, they increased it by 20 times over. The result was hyperinflation that tore the social fabric apart. We need to visualize what this looked like on the ground. It wasn't just numbers on a ledger, it was starvation. In 1863, a housewife in Richmond might go to the market with a basket full of money, hoping to return with a basket full of food, only to find she could barely afford a few turnips. Speculation became rampant. If you held onto Confederate dollars for a week, you lost purchasing power. So people spent money the second they got it, creating a hot potato effect that increased the velocity of money and drove inflation even higher. The government tried to fix it with price controls, which only led to hoarding and black markets. Farmers refused to sell their produce to the army because the army paid in worthless paper, while they could barter with civilians for real goods. This led to the bizarre reality where the Confederate Army was starving in a land that was agriculturally rich. In 1863, bread riots broke out across southern cities. Women armed with knives and hatchets stormed shops, not stealing jewelry or silver, but stealing flour and bacon, screaming bread or blood. The government's response to the monetary crisis revealed the depth of their desperation. In 1864, the Confederate Congress passed a Currency Reform Act that required bondholders to exchange their old notes for new ones at a rate of 3 to 2, effectively defaulting on a third of the public-is money. It was a forced haircut on the entire population. Instead of stabilizing the currency, it destroyed the last shred of faith the people had in their government. If the state could simply cancel the value of the money in your pocket, then the money was truly worth nothing. By 1865, the economy had devolved into a primitive barter system. A haircut cost 2 eggs. A visit to the doctor cost a side of bacon. The complicated financial networks of the 19th century had regressed to the Stone Age. The Confederate dollar had ceased to function as a store of value or a medium of exchange. It was just paper with a promise printed on it, a promise from a government that was ceasing to exist. The legacy of this collapse is a stark lesson in the fragility of power. The South believed their economic leverage was absolute. They confused a temporary market dominance with permanent strategic power. We see this same error of judgment echoed in the modern world. We see petrostates that believe they can weaponize energy supplies, only to find that high prices accelerate the transition to renewables. We see nations that monopolize rare earth minerals or manufacturing capacity, believing they can dictate terms to the world, forgetting that markets are fluid and that dependence is never static. The Confederate leaders looked at their white fields and saw a king that commanded the world. They didn't realize that a king without a treasury is just a man in a costume. By the time they realized that cotton was a commodity, not a magic wand, their economy had already burned to the ground. When the end finally came, it wasn't the Union Army that dealt the final blow to the Southern spirit. It was the realization that their sacrifices had been funded by a lie. The soldiers, walking home in April 1865, were carrying pockets full of cash that couldn't buy a single meal. They had learned the hard way that you cannot print prosperity, and you cannot bully the free market without eventually paying the price. History is filled with nations that lost wars. But the Confederacy holds the unique distinction of a nation that managed to bankrupt itself before the enemy even breached the gates. They bet everything on a single card, and when the market called their bluff, they had nothing left to put on the table. There is a rhythm to these collapses. It starts with hubris, moves to denial, accelerates through the printing press, and ends in the fire. If you listen closely to the global economy today, to the endless printing of unbacked currency and the weaponization of supply chains, you might just hear the faint, ghostly echo of that same rhythm beating again.